Welcome to the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records presentation on the reorganizing, sunsetting, and rebuilding or reactive records management, brought to you by the Records Management Branch and presented by me, Aeneas Santiago, the Records Management Specialist in our small unit. The Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records is a sub-function of the Secretary of State. As we hope to provide more resources for running into cases like these, please contact us if you have any questions or recommendations. What I hope to cover today will be used by those taking on the responsibility of or responsible for records management in state and local agencies, especially during low points or sunsetting. We'll cover topics like the foundation, establishing why we're here and what areas of concern may exist that prompt the undergoing of these processes, why records management matters in times of reorganization, rebuilding, or sunsetting, the implication of records management done well or poorly regardless, additional triggers or events that are common in prompting change in records management, and ultimate application back into the introductory presentation's RIM model. Then, as opposed to the usual educational format of other presentations, we will instead give step-by-step processes for what is recommended to be done or considered in reorganizing, sunsetting, and rebuilding. These processes may leave a lot of questions after the fact. We anticipate that, which is why we'll also outline where to go from there and what the goals, priorities, preventions, and practices are from the end of the instructionals onward. Lastly, we'll also provide our contact or a couple of resources sprinkled in of who to go to for recommendations or assistance if all else fails. Before we get into specifics, we need to understand the foundations that brought us here. It's easy to place the blame on individuals for poor practice or negligence, especially when inheriting a mismanaged system or closing out records for a sunsetting agency. While staff do play a role, the root cause is far more often process or the lack of it. Faulty, unclear, or underdeveloped processes create uncertainty about how to handle records during periods of change. And records management is often deprioritized or ignored entirely during those times, which drastically increases risk. Proper records management practices and controls are exactly what prevent these situations or allow records to be transitioned efficiently and lawfully from one body or staff group to another. As we'll emphasize throughout this presentation, our role is to provide guidance and goals. Every agency, process, and transition is different, and the levels of risk certainly vary. Because of that, we can only offer general guidance. The detailed implementation and decision-making must be assessed and carried out internally by agency itself. During these transitions, staff may need to directly identify, sort, and transfer records in small or large volumes. Processes that should already exist may need to be created, completed, or formalized, and managers will need to sign off on disposition and compliance decisions for legal and chain of command reasons. The circumstances that brought us here now require a more hands-on approach. Beyond using us as a resource, it's important to revisit the stakeholders mentioned in the introductory presentation. Those who create, manage, use, or rely on records throughout their life cycle. Referring back to these stakeholders helps ensure we don't over-engineer solutions, miss critical insight, or overlook key responsibilities. When in doubt, return to the roots and build from there. Why do records and their management matter when reorganization, sunsetting, or mismanagement may seem like much larger issues? What if you're not a records management specialist or don't particularly want to be but still need direction? Well, at the most basic level, records tell the story of something or someone. an agency, a division, a process, or an individual staff member. Records are how mismanagement or misuse of public funds is uncovered, how audits and investigations are conducted, and how accountability is established. The media understands their importance, the public feels their impact, and now you do too. Records an agency keeps and how they are managed can reveal both strengths and weaknesses. Positive indicators include transparency, efficiency, compliance, responsiveness, collaboration, and success. But, on the other hand, poor records practices can expose negligence, lack of transparency, misrepresentation, informal or inconsistent processes, and the loss of institutional knowledge as staff turnover occurs. At some point, a breakdown occurred or a decision was made that change was necessary, whether due to exposure of poor practices, consolidation efforts, or another driver. That moment places responsibility squarely on us as records managers, coordinators, or those undertaking those responsibilities to step in as actively implementing change. What change was required and how did it come about? Well, typically records management changes in process is prompted by several common drivers, such as sunsetting, leadership or staffing changes, records cleanups, court or audit mandates, or procedural reorganization or consolidation. While these situations may look different on the surface, they are all sharing one underlying reality. The goals of your records, or how you achieve them, are changing. That single premise creates opportunity. A change that may have been difficult to implement before can now be introduced alongside new systems, processes, or expectations. The entity initiating the change expects some kind of improvement, and introducing new or revised practices often makes those improvements easier to achieve and demonstrate. Being proactive is crucial. If you see change coming or recognize where change is needed, start exploring solutions early on so you can prevent issues or be prepared for them. Don't wait until the problem escalates into an audit finding, legal issue, or procedural failure. Address it now. What if you don't know when change is coming or where it's needed? In reality, records management is always evolving. There is no single approach that will remain effective for decades. New technologies, staff, and ideas continuously reshape how records are created and managed. When improvement isn't encouraged or explored, warning signs begin to appear, much like an aging vehicle with dashboard lights turning on. Using the RIM, or Records and Information Management Program model from the introductory presentation, we can identify these warning signs. Most agencies already have some form of records management program, but it may need to be realigned to the RIM model. Over time, certain elements often begin to degrade, either agency-wide or within specific functions. For example, failure to apply retention schedules can result in over-retention, premature destruction, or illegal disposal. Inconsistent maintenance, slow retrieval, unclear conventions, and outdated practices frustrate staff and supervisors. A lack of routine review or training leads to knowledge gaps, inefficiencies, and unnecessary steps that no longer serve a purpose. This slide highlights examples of warning signs and their long-term impacts. Even if responsibility for a record changes hands at some point in the life cycle, failure at any stage affects the entire process and everybody within it. The consequences don't stop with the individual or unit that made the mistake. They extend to everyone involved. How does this all relate to sunsetting anyway? How are reorganization, mismanagement, and sunsetting connected? These processes are often viewed negatively, especially when prompted by failure, external pressure, or audit. However, sunsetting can be thought of as winding down. while reorganization or rebuilding is winding back up, both aimed at returning records management to an agency's baseline responsibilities. That baseline is outlined in the introductory presentation and supporting guidance. Sunsetting moves records management from wherever it currently sits above or below that baseline and carefully winds it down, with migration, historical value, and institutional memory becoming top priorities above others as functions close or transfer. Reorganization or rebuilding does the opposite. It moves records management upward towards the baseline and beyond, focusing on authentication, reclassification, accountability, and innovation. While the specifics differ, both processes place significant responsibility on records, contingency planning, and continuity of essential services. Addressing weaknesses now, regardless of whether an agency is sunsetting, reduces risk later. Records obligations do not disappear, whether an agency is sunset or not, and failures to meet legal or regulatory standards can still surface long after the change, especially if records or institutional knowledge were lost in the process. Given this context, then, it should be clear that having a contingency plan of some kind, or at least a defined course of action for identifying and addressing immediate and foreseeable records issues, is essential. Now that we've covered the background and our perspective from records management, we can move into step-by-step general guidance for how to approach these processes. For each of these processes, we break the work down into 3 phases. For reorganization, the first phase is assessment, which serves as the foundation for everything that follows. This phase focuses on identifying the basic 5 W's of your records and defining the ultimate goal of the reorganization, whether that means refining a single process or fully restructuring how records are managed. We begin with the fundamentals. First, the agency should designate a records officer, or coordinate directly with the existing records officer to outline the rest of the process. If you are unsure who that is, contact us or consult our resources. Next, clearly define staff roles and responsibilities related to records during the reorganization, especially to maintain continuity and determine any transitional authority. This information is typically found in policy, standard operating procedures, or other internal guidance. Legal and regulatory obligations should be reviewed at the outset. This ensures that plan changes are lawful, defensible, and aligned with any specific statutory or regulatory requirements tied to the agency's mission. At this stage, it is also important to establish a working group or gather staff input. This could be as simple as engaging the affected unit, or as formal as creating an information governance team that includes IT, legal, and executive leadership. Together, these steps establish governance and accountability before moving forward. From there, assess the current state of records, starting with an inventory. Identify all records locations, types, volumes, retention requirements, controls, and ownership. We provide a presentation and suggested form for this purpose. Document everything, missing records, unmanaged collections, or records that should have been disposed of or transferred will become evident and should be addressed promptly. Flag any confidential, sensitive, or high-risk records so permissions and authorizations can be reviewed. Once you know what records exist, evaluate how they are managed. Review policies, retention schedules, systems, processes, controls, disposition practices, and staff knowledge across the records lifecycle. Identifying gaps, inefficiencies, and training needs at this stage prevents future inconsistencies during reorganization. When ready, define what the reorganization actually means for your agency, compliance, accessibility, digitization, or another goal, and prioritize approaches that are efficient, modular, and scalable. Clarify what success looks like and how it will be measured. Before moving on, the path forward must be clearly defined so the reorganization is intentional and well planned, not reactive. Once the plan feels solid, we move into the second phase, control and transition. At this point, we understand the records landscape, what is changing, and what completion looks like. Now, the focus is on implementation. The first step is revising policy and procedures to establish a strong foundation. Policies should address emails and messaging, records creation and handling, public records requests, retention and disposition, legal holds, custody changes, and version control. In short, though, every stage of the record's life cycle and how staff interact with it should be clearly documented through policy, standard operating procedures, or guidance used daily by staff. Next, update records classification. Ensure records are classified by function rather than organizational structure, and standardize naming conventions, filing systems, metadata, and finding aids so records remain accessible over time. For metadata, that is included in our digital records presentation. Begin identifying where automation can be applied, such as automatic retention, record capture, or locking finalized records. Retention schedules should then be reviewed and updated with us. So legal requirements, staff input, risk, and frequency of use should inform retention periods. If niche or non-standard records are identified, work with us to develop complementary retention guidance, aka custom retention schedules. Policies should clearly define when records become inactive and how they are stored or separated. Secure, approved methods for disposition, so internal or third party or in-house, must also be established to ensure records cannot be reconstructed. Once these controls are in place, obsolete, transitory, and non-records become much easier to identify and dispose of. Address incomplete records immediately, dispose of unofficial copies, separate permanent from non-permanent records, and identify essential records, for example. Permanent records may be transferred to the state archives if appropriate. Organization and maintenance are critical, and our resources support that work. This phase also highlights opportunities for digital improvements. Rather than viewing systems as nice to have, include them now while authorizations can still be readily obtained. Ensure systems have audit trails, permissions, folder structures, file plans, and retention controls applied routinely. As reorganization is implemented, the goal is to prevent loss of information, institutional knowledge, or efficiency while introducing improved practices. Retraining staff may be necessary to support that transition. At the end of reorganization, the goal is not simply to finish moving records around, but to ensure the new structure holds over time. This phase, stabilization and validation, is where the reorganization becomes a new normal, and where the agency evaluates whether the changes improve records management, compliance, and usability. Retraining is critical at this stage, especially when responsibilities or workflows have shifted. Training should be role-based rather than function-based, recognizing that managers, staff, and external users interact with records differently. Managers should understand oversight, accountability, and escalation. Staff should understand day-to-day filing, access, and disposition, and any external users should know how records are requested or accessed under the new structure. Staff should actively engage with policies, standard operating procedures, and guidance documents, and translate those into their own working practices. Emphasis should be placed on controls, how to file records correctly, what does not need to be kept, when records should be disposed of, and how records support the agency's broader mission. This helps embed records management into daily operations rather than treating it as a separate obligation. To ensure the system is working as intended, periodic audits should be conducted. These audits reinforce retention compliance, identify risks early, and flag inconsistencies before they escalate. Laws, regulations, and internal policies should be reviewed at least annually, as changes in any of these can directly impact records obligations. Monitoring should be routine and predictable so adjustments can be made proactively. Finally, stabilization is not a one-time event. As new systems, processes, or program changes emerge, agencies should revisit this phase. Executive oversight, engagement with the records officer, collaboration with peer agencies, and participation in professional organizations all help ensure the program continues to mature. Reorganization should be viewed as a managed evolution, not a disruption. Sunsetting refers to the formal closure or discontinuation of a function, program, office, or entire agency after a specific date. While many aspects of sunsetting involve operational, fiscal, or staffing considerations, records obligations persist regardless of closure and must be addressed deliberately. Even when a function ceases to exist, its records do not. Responsibility for those records transfers to whoever assumes custody, and that successor inherits all associated legal, regulatory, and retention obligations. Because of this, records planning cannot be an afterthought during sunsetting. Sunsetting must be formally recognized through authoritative action, such as an Auditor General report, legislative or committee findings, executive direction, or another official determination. This recognition of yours should include a documented analysis of the reasons for sunsetting, anticipated impacts, risks, and major transition considerations. These elements form the backbone of records planning. Once these fundamentals are established, agencies should contact us. We will establish a coordinated team involving records management, the state archives, the agency, and the successor organization. This ensures consistent guidance, compliance, and communication through the process. Initial meetings focus on confirming records staff, reviewing inventories, clarifying responsibilities, establishing timelines, and identifying compliance requirements. Agencies should simultaneously review statutes, regulations, and internal policies governing the records of the function being sunset, paying particular attention to confidentiality, legal restrictions, and records of long-term value. This phase answers the central question, what does closure look like and how do we get there responsibly? With preparatory planning complete, agencies can now move into the execution phase. Throughout this phase, communication with the successor entity is critical so there are no uncertainties about what records exist, what actions are being taken, and what responsibilities will transfer. Transparency here reduces risk and prevents last-minute surprises. From a records perspective, the primary concern during this phase is disposition, meaning a clear determination of what records will be transferred, destroyed, or retained temporarily. The success of this step depends heavily on the quality of the records inventory. A detailed and accurate inventory simplifies decision-making. Validate that inventory with us to ensure completeness and accuracy. Confirming record series against approved retention schedules, and verify that all formats, locations, volumes, and access considerations are included. Additional details, such as editors, sensitivity level, essential status, and permanence, should be documented so obligations can be applied consistently. Our inventory tools and presentations are available to support this work. Once inventorying is complete, Apply all legal and operational obligations to the records. Confirm whether records are eligible for disposition under retention schedules, subject to legal holds, audits, litigation, or other restrictions, or affected by confidentiality requirements. Any barriers to disposition should be addressed collaboratively with us and the successor during this phase to avoid delays later. With obligations identified, determine the appropriate pathway for each group of records. Records scheduled for destruction require a documented disposal plan and approved method. Records designated for transfer must be coordinated with the receiving entity or the state archive. Permanent records that are no longer actively needed should be transferred to the state archive, while active or operational records should be transferred to the successor with clear custody. While this step may require multiple coordination meetings, it significantly streamlines closure. Finally, dispose of eligible records and transitory documents using approved methods and complete certificates of destruction as required. This stage is about reduction and focus, removing everything that no longer has legal, fiscal, or administrative value, so attention can be directed only to records that must continue forward. The guiding question becomes, what can we responsibly eliminate, migrate, or document now before closure? As records are reduced and organized, the final phase begins, final transfer and wrap-up. This phase addresses two core questions: who receives the records after closure, and how those records will remain usable and accessible. Agencies should not simply transfer records and disengage. Statutory obligations require active participation in integrating records into the successor's environment. This includes explaining how records were organized, what controls were applied, and what contextual knowledge is necessary to use them effectively. This is about process continuity, not ownership. Training and advisory sessions for successor staff are strongly recommended. These sessions help prevent loss of institutional knowledge and reduce the risk of misinterpretation or mishandling of inherited records. Disposition through transfer of custody should now be finalized. Sensitive, incomplete, or restricted records must be clearly identified and communicated to the successor. All transfers should be documented using required forms and submitted to us, unless previously addressed in coordination meetings. Any remaining disposition actions must be completed at this point. Legal holds must be communicated, retention schedule alignment verified, and storage facilities reviewed for compliance with minimum documentation standards. Records that fail to meet minimum requirements should be identified and resolved before transfer. Incomplete records should be finalized where possible, and stakeholders, particularly the public, must be notified of new points in contact for records request. This ensures continued service and clarity after closure. Conduct a reconciliation between the inventory and all transfers and destructions to confirm that no records remain unaccounted for. Revisit legal and procedural obligations to certify full compliance, addressing any outstanding issues immediately. Prepare a comprehensive audit quality closure report documenting all actions taken. This report should include inventories, retention references, transfers, destructions, certificates, dates, deviations, and justifications. It serves as formal evidence that the agency met its obligations fully and responsibly. Provide any final guidance or training to the successor, document the handoff in writing, update internal systems to reflect closure, notify stakeholders, and complete a final review. The goal is for records to remain just as usable after the sunset as they were before it. Picking up the pieces or rebuilding usually happens because records were mismanaged, neglected, or handled inconsistently over time. This is often frustrating, but it also means that the response must be immediate and deliberate. The first priority is to pause and stabilize the situation before any additional damage occurs. At the outset, designate a records officer in coordination with us. If one already exists, ensure that they are actively involved and empowered to intervene. Each division, program, or subfunction should also have a records liaison who handles day-to-day records coordination. Clearly define roles, responsibilities, escalation paths, and accountability across leadership and staff. Oversight should not rely on a single individual. Policy, procedures, and practical checks must reinforce expectations at multiple levels. Direct intervention is often necessary during rebuilding. Any questionable or high-risk practices must be suspended immediately. This includes halting destruction activities, pausing undocumented cleanups, and applying legal or administrative holds where appropriate. Records at risk loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure, or incompletion must be protected first. High-risk environments such as shared drives, email accounts, personal storage devices, and unmanaged program systems should be identified, monitored, and brought under formal control with documented procedures and authorization. Once harmful practices are stopped, conduct a full assessment to understand the scope of the problem. This includes identifying all physical and digital repositories, formats, record creators, owners, access permissions, and lifecycle practices. The goal is to understand not only where records exist, but how they are created, used, modified, and stored. A records inventory is strongly recommended at this stage and is often the clearest way to reveal gaps, redundancies, and compliance failures. With this information, evaluate risks across legal, regulatory, operational, financial, reputational, and programmatic areas. Focus first on high-risk records and repositories, ranking them by likelihood and impact. While all issues should eventually be addressed, prioritizing the most serious risks ensures stabilization happens quickly and effectively. From this assessment, develop a remediation plan. This plan should clearly identify what went wrong, what needs to be corrected, and how those corrections will be implemented. Remediation may involve policy updates, retraining, reorganizing records, implementing new controls, or restructuring workflows. Throughout this process, preserve as much institutional knowledge as possible. Understanding how and why past practices developed helps prevent repeating the same mistakes. With the assessment complete, this phase focuses on action and correction. Before making record-by-record decisions, revise or create foundational policy, conventions, retention guidance, and procedural documents. These rules must be clear, enforceable, and aligned with applicable laws, regulations, and our guidance. Communicate changes agency-wide so similar issues do not persist elsewhere. Next, reorganize and reclassify records. Separate records from non-records, permanent from non-permanent, and transitory materials from official documentation. Standardize filing structures, naming conventions, and metadata, which is explained in the digital records presentation, so records can be retrieved easily and consistently. Redundant, obsolete, or trivial information should be validated for disposition and disposed of appropriately, ensuring the organization reflects the purpose and value of each record. This is also an ideal point to introduce technology improvements. Automation, digitization, and system configuration can make records harder to mismanage and easier to control. This includes enforcing retention automatically, restricting unauthorized access or editing, capturing records from unmanaged environments, and integrating retention controls for email and collaboration platforms. Establish audit mechanisms and a clear chain of command for review. Before moving forward, secure executive approvals and complete any required documentation, such as certificates of destruction or records officer designation forms. Confirm that all records align with an approved retention schedule published by us, and work with us to address any gaps. Transfer inactive permanent records to the state archives when appropriate, and maintain updated inventories and disposition logs so future reviews are easier and more transparent. Training is critical during rebuilding. Training should be role-based and emphasize what constitutes a record, how to file and retrieve records, access controls, accountability, and review requirements. Staff should understand not only what to do, but why it matters. Most records failures begin with incomplete information, misunderstanding, or lack of clarity. This phase is about resolving immediate and medium-term issues. Long-term refinement comes next. Once corrective actions are in place, the focus shifts to long-term management and oversight. This phase ensures the rebuilt system remains stable, compliant, and adaptable. Monitoring and audit controls should be established, such as routine system reports, spot checks, or performance metrics related to filing timeliness, retention compliance, workload distribution, or disposition rates. Records management requirements should be embedded into program operations and system planning. Proactive planning reduces the need for disruptive reorganizations later. Changes in staffing, program scope, or technology should always trigger a records review to ensure continuity and accountability. A governance body is strongly recommended to oversee records management. This may include executive leadership, the records officer, records coordinators, IT leadership, legal counsel, and information security representatives. Roles and responsibilities must be clearly defined and reinforced through policy, job descriptions, and performance evaluations. Training should be reassessed regularly and updated when policies change, systems are modified, audits identify weaknesses, or staff provide feedback. Agencies should remain open to testing new practices or tools that improve compliance and usability rather than waiting for issues to arise. Success should be measured using data, track outcomes, identify trends, adjust goals, and document lessons learned. Anticipate future changes, such as system replacements or program sunsets, and plan for migration or transition early. This phase answers the question, now that we are stable, how do we stay that way? Sure, these processes are fine and dandy, especially in a step-by-step format, but they are only effective if the underlying objectives are understood. This section explains the reasoning behind these approaches and connects them to broader records management goals. We also provide a concise mission statement that can be used to guide policy and decision-making moving forward. At this point, we step back and look at priorities and guiding considerations across the different processes. While reorganizing and rebuilding may appear different in scope or urgency, they share the same underlying goal: to establish immediate, functional records management controls that preserve accountability, continuity, and statutory obligations. For both processes, the emphasis is on stabilizing records practices quickly so that decision-making, service delivery, and legal compliance are not disrupted. This includes knowing what records exist, who owns them, and how they are accessed, and how long they must be kept. Without this baseline, any operational improvement or restructuring is built on uncertainty. Sunsetting, however, introduces a different priority: accountability beyond closure. Once a function or agency ceases to operate, records still carry legal, historical, and operational value. Sunsetting must answer fundamental questions such as who will take custody of the records, which records are permanent, what obligations continue after the function ends. These considerations overall ensure records are not abandoned, improperly destroyed, or rendered inaccessible during that change. For reorganizing and rebuilding, priorities focus on continuity of operations and usability. Agencies must ensure that records remain accessible during and after change. Ownership is clearly assigned, and records are organized by function rather than shifting organizational charts. Legal, audit, public access, and program needs must all be balanced. These priorities shape every decision made throughout the process and serve as the baseline against which success is measured. From these priorities, we move into practical application. The goals across all scenarios is to establish practices that ensure lawful retention, clear and documented custody, and interrupted access to records. In sunsetting, this work is more intensive and time-sensitive. It involves conducting a comprehensive inventory, physically and digitally preparing records for disposition, coordinating closely with us and other stakeholders, and documenting every action taken. Legal counsel, IT, and leadership often play key roles in ensuring systems remain accessible and obligations such as legal holds are met. Stakeholders must be notified, systems cleared or transitioned, and obsolete records identified and disposed of appropriately. In reorganization or rebuilding, the work is less severe but no less deliberate. Records ownership may need to be reassigned, retention requirements updated, and dependencies mapped across programs and systems. Policies and guidance should be established or refined to reflect the new structure. Filing conventions and controls must be standardized so records are easy to locate and understand regardless of staffing changes. Duplicate or overlapping records should be disposed of, roles and responsibilities clearly delegated, and controls implemented to prevent future mismanagement. In both cases, documentation is essential. A well-documented records program supports transparency, accountability, and continuity long after the immediate changes are complete. Failing to follow these processes can have serious consequences. Poorly managed sunsetting can lead to lost records, inability to respond to legal holds, improper destruction, or even reputational harm after the fact. Poor reorganization or rebuilding can result in confusion, duplicated work, service delays, inconsistent responses, or loss of institutional knowledge. But what we talked about prevents all of that and more. These risks are not theoretical. They are common outcomes when records management is overlooked or deprioritized. At its core, strong records management makes change manageable rather than disruptive. When records are well organized, properly retained, and clearly owned, reorganizing, rebuilding, and sunsetting requires far fewer corrective steps and places less strain on staff and leadership. It is important to recognize that there is no single permanent solution. Records management is a dynamic field shaped by changes in law, technology, staffing, and public expectations. Even small reorganizations occur routinely, and practices must evolve alongside them. While these step-by-step processes provide structure, they will not capture every possible scenario. The value lies in knowing where you are in the process, what questions to ask, and how to identify gaps when additional considerations arise. This flexibility allows agencies to adapt without losing compliance or control. To avoid future crises, agencies should rely on both internal expertise and external resources. Use our guidance, training materials and tools, survey staff for practical insight, collaborate with peer agencies and professional organizations, and document decisions carefully. Doing this due diligence early ensures that when change happens, and it will, it is handled deliberately, defensively, and sustainably rather than reactively. Thank you for viewing this presentation, and if you have any questions, please ask us on our website or send us an email at records@azlibrary.gov. This presentation also accompanies quick tutorial videos on how to fill out each form specifically that may have been talked about, as well as other presentation materials that may clarify certain areas contextually.